Good morning, everyone. We're going to give it a minute or two as people are joining just to get settled, and then we'll begin. Okay, Brian, shall we make a start?
Absolutely.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome from Positive to the next webinar in our free webinar series. Today's topic is the psychological impact of furloughing on health, culture, and performance. We'll start with some introductions for those of you that don't know us. My name is Dr. Sinead Devine French. I'm a psychologist and I'm head of product with Positive Group. And this is my colleague.
Hi, I'm Brian Marion. I'm a doctor of medicine and a cognitive and behavioral psychologist.
And a little bit about Positive for those of you that don't know us. So Positive Group, we are a multidisciplinary team. We are science-based and we work with individuals, teams and organizations to help them understand more about the science and psychology of sustainable well-being and performance. We take a very practical and proactive approach. Now, the key aim for today's session is to explore what leaders and organizations can do to take a psychologically informed approach to furloughing and the impact that this can have on our individuals, our culture, and our performance over time. So to begin with, I think it's really important to explore the context that furloughing sits within. So within a few months ago, I think it's fair to say that most people in the UK hadn't heard of the term furloughing before, but it's quickly become a very vital life raft and lifeline for a number of organisations. And in fact, the BBC estimates that within the first 30 minutes of the furloughing scheme going live, 67,000 organisations and businesses had signed up to it. So it's very much been positioned around our economic health and survival, but there's been little focus on the psychological impact that it has and will have on us going forward. So exploring the theme of furloughing and the context of coronavirus, I think it's important to start by saying that this is quite a unique time for the human species. And the potential psychological impact of this is huge. It's a bit of a perfect storm because of its ability to impact on so many different areas of our life. So the uncertainty linked to coronavirus can touch our family life, our work life, our health, our future prospects, our job security, so many different variables. And I'd like to start by thinking about our psychological health and well-being and how it varies so much from person to person. So at Positive, if I just try and click to my next slide. At Positive, we take an approach which considers health and well-being sitting on a continuum. So rather than saying that people are well or unwell, we think about psychological health as something that is fluid and dynamic. At one end of the continuum is where we're feeling unwell, and at the opposite end of the continuum is where we're flourishing and tip-top. Now, the important thing to note is that where we sit on the continuum will have a huge impact on how we think, feel, and behave, on how we connect with each other, how we make each other feel, our ability to perform well within our role, so how we think and the decisions that we make. Now, where we sit in this continuum is impacted by a number of variables, and I think that's really crucial to tune into, because when considering the impact, the psychological impact of furlough on individuals, it's important to say that there's a lot of individual variation here. So how it impacts me may be very different to how it impacts you. And where we sit on this continuum is affected by lots of things, from our genetics to our past experiences and our backstory to the challenges that we're currently experiencing and the unique impact that each of those can have on us. So Brian, at Positive, we often say that it's not so much the things that happen to us that's important, as the view we take of them and our perception of them. So I'd like to start by asking you, what do you think might be happening for people and their health and well-being in the context of being furloughed?
Well, I think what, as you've just outlined, I think we have got a perfect storm. We have so many uncertainties in our world at the moment, with economic volatility, recession, financial insecurity, health worries, family, friends. So on almost every level, this is creating huge threat. And I think just to put that into context, what happens with uncertainty is, and you can see this in, throughout our lives, what human beings like is familiarity, predictability. We feel comfortable or more comfortable in that environment. And if you look at youngsters who change school or go from school to university, or we go from university to work, or we change role, most of us, when we're going into a new environment that is strange and novel, start to feel a bit of anxiety. So we start to what if. And that what ifing could be, will I fit in? Will people like me? How will it go? Will it work? Will I fail? Etc. And that's a very normal process. So I think just contextually, this has got so much threat around uncertainty, around so many dynamics, and it's got fingers into so many different arenas of our life. But I think it's a unique situation, and I think it is creating a lot of anxiety and a lot of worry. In fact, Richard Bentel, who's a consultant clinical psychologist, has done some research over the last few weeks showing an escalation a doubling of the levels of anxiety and low mood in the UK population. Now, it does seem to be leveling out, but I think that's a very natural and normal response to what is an extraordinarily difficult environment. But I think just putting that into context, so if we start to feel anxious and worried, it can start to impact on how we think, feel and behave. So I think if we just look at this first part of the slide, the mood state slide, this is central to sort of cognitive psychology. And these are connecting how we think, and that cognition stands for thoughts and images, how we feel, which is the emotion, our central chemistry, which is our neurotransmitters and our neural circuits, our physiology, which is how we feel physically, and our behavior. And these are all interrelated. So if we just take a very simple example, if we take an example, let's say I'm at home on my own and I've watched 4 weddings and a funeral and had a nice glass of wine, and I go to bed, I wake up, I hear a noise in the night. Now, what we're looking at here is how we process information. So if I'm feeling calm, relaxed and content and I hear the noise, I might think, so this is my cognition, I might think that's my Labrador scratching himself in the basket. Now, provided I have a Labrador, it's not a deluded thought. That thought actually is quite benign. It may make me feel quite happy. I may release a bit of oxytocin and dopamine into my neural circuit because I love my Labrador. My physiology is to remain calm and relaxed, and my behavior is to pull up the duvet and go back to sleep. However, if I've watched Psycho before I went to bed, or I'd been down the pub when we used to go down the pub, and a neighbor tells me that there's been a break-in down the road, now I wake up, I hear exactly the same noise. And I think to myself, there's an intruder in the house. That thought, that cognition, that image will change my brain chemistry in about 7 milliseconds. It changes my physiology in 150 milliseconds. I've now got a thumping heart, dry mouth, sweaty palms on the basis of a thought. And my behavior is not to pull up the duvet and go back to sleep. I'm wired to the moon. I can't take my attention away from the noise. Now, I think understanding this model is really important. And what's driving this is my emotion is driving my thinking. And my thinking is then becoming distorted, irrational, catastrophic, and that makes me more anxious. But getting more anxious makes me have more spooky thoughts. And this is interesting because we can then maintain our levels of anxiety. And so what's now happening is we can generate anxiety in our own heads. And I think this is an important dynamic. But if you put this into the furloughing position, if we had person A who works for an airline and they're made redundant or they're furloughed, They might think to themselves, well, that's okay. I've got a set of skills. I'll take a few months of gardening leave and I will actually get back to work. I've got some very saleable skills and I can join another airline. It'll be fine. The emotion is quite relaxed. Their central chemistry is one where they see themselves managing and coping. They're running the video on fast forward. They feel relatively safe. They get very little physiological arousal. Their behavior is to update their CV, think about which airlines to approach, and actually start to make contacts with people to see what they can do to mitigate this situation. However, in our current environment, if you're employed by an airline, your cognition may be think, I'm being furloughed. There is no way I'm going to get another job in the airline industry. No one knows when anyone's going to be flying again. Lots of countries have locked their borders. What am I going to do? And this starts to create anxiety. And then the anxiety starts to generate more spooky thoughts. I won't be able to put bread on the table. We'll have to get rid of the house. The kids will have to come out of school. I don't know how I'm going to cope. This is going to ruin my life. So this process can start to escalate a sense of anxiety and distress. So I'm going to come back to the state bit in a moment, but if we could just move to the next bit, which is trait. The trait bit is that when these things happen to us, if we have a backstory, if we have a past history of losing our job before, or bad things happening, or feeling excluded, or feeling distressed, then what can happen is this new event wakes up that database. It wakes up that memory, and that can compound our feeling of distress. So I think there's a trait bit and there's a state bit. And then if we could just flip on to the next, and I think this is what you were talking about at the beginning, that we have a perfect storm, that this is a really worrying and distressing time. So our levels of stress and anxiety are elevated. And then if something happens to us, like furloughing, we are already feeling anxious, which then drives how we think, feel, and behave, which then can keep us in this state of distress, anxiety, and worry.
And I think just to add to your point there, Brian, what's interesting is that there's so much variation person to person in this because of the reasons that you've outlined. But even within an individual person, this really can shift over time. So actually how I feel about being furloughed on day 1 versus how I feel about being furloughed on day 30, I may have gone on quite the journey in that time. And that journey can be informed by the news, the media, the projections about what's happening in the economy. So I think it's about noticing that individuals vary from person to person, and then within person over time in relation to how they think, feel, and behave in the face of furlough. I think what's interesting is that there's been some research into the psychological impact of furlough in the US. Now, the context of this research was very different. But what intrigued me was that it showed that there could be a short-term negative impact on people's mood, on their sleep, a deterioration in their psychological health in the short term. But interestingly, it showed a longer-term potential impact as well. So furlough reaching back into the workplace after people return to work. And one of the suggestions in the literature is that this is down to people's perceptions of how they feel they were managed by their teams, by their team leaders, by their organization, and the perception that there might have been a perceived break in a psychological contract between me, the individual, and the group that I work for. So Brian, I want to just go back to you to ask a question about how can this perception around your psychological contract with your employer impact your well-being and the kind of longer term impacts of this on perhaps the culture of the organization and the performance of the organization?
Yes, I think this is a really interesting area, and I think very relevant to furloughing, because there's a concept in cognitive psychology and stoicism, which is it's not what happens, it's the view you take of it. And the psychological contract is basically an implicit contract. It's not an explicit terms and conditions. You don't sign the contract. This is a sort of expectation of employees about how their employer will behave. And there's a sort of expectation or trust that is linked to that. And it's implicit, it isn't written, but if it's broken, if it's perceived to be broken, so there are broken promises or people are not keeping their end of the deal, then the psychological contract starts to break down. And then this can create a sense of frustration, anger, and it is linked to engagement, motivation, discretionary effort, and how you think about this. So this is a trust relationship. And in a way, if the psychological contract is broken, it breaks the trust. And that wonderful African proverb, trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. I think it's very easy to break trust. And I think just going into the psychological contract in a little more depth, I think if you look at what happens to human beings are incredibly social animals. And they argue that, a lot of neuroscientists argue that a lot of our brain development from other primates is because of our social interaction. And we need to understand other people. And what we do as human beings is we can combine, collaborate, we can work collegiately, we can support each other in teams. And that's incredibly good for us. And actually it changes your neurochemistry. So good social support, good social connection actually makes us feel good. It pushes up oxytocin, it pushes up dopamine, it makes us feel contented. And it's incredibly good for our health. And that's true from the cradle to the grave. So little children who receive nourishment and warmth and love, actually they wire up their brains very differently to children who don't receive warmth, love and nurture. And we saw that with the tragic examples of the Romanian orphanages. This has a biological effect on us. So our relationships impact on our neurology, they impact on our biology, they impact on our health, and they impact on our longevity. So this has what we now know is an epigenetic effect. It switches genes on and off. So this isn't fluffy, woolly, nice to have. This social connection is incredibly important. And I think what happens with furloughing and the psychological contract is for some people, the contract is damaged. And as you said, that's personal, it's idiosyncratic. And the interesting thing is that people who are furloughed then feel excluded. So they're no longer included in the organization, they've been put on furlough. Now this can wake up all sorts of feelings. And when we're excluded from the group, it activates a threat circuit in our brain. In fact, it creates social pain. Being excluded, you only need to think about youngsters not being invited to the party or their friend not talking to them. Exclusion is a painful experience, and it activates a neural circuit in your brain that you can see on an fMRI scan, which is very similar to physical pain. And so this is sometimes called social pain. It's a form of suffering. Now, the reason for that is we want to be included because we only left Africa 60,000 years ago. To be excluded can actually predict our chances of survival. So we want to be in the group. We want to be accepted by the group. And what furloughing can mean for some people is exclusion. And there was a lovely study done by a woman called Naomi Eisenberger in America, where she did a thing called cyberball, which you can look at online. And you're an avatar and you go on and these people throw a ball to you and they include you and then they exclude you. Most people who play that game as an avatar on a computer game feel a sense of pain and rejection. This is hardwired into it. So I think the first thing to be aware of is the quality of our relationships, and inclusion is very powerful. So this can press a button for some people and they suddenly start to think this is unfair, this shouldn't be happening. The second bit, I think, is around status. I think all human beings care about how they're seen in the eyes of others. Michael Marmot, who's the first author of the Great Whitehall Study, who's an epidemiologist, has shown how important status is. People who have high status, who are respected, have lower cortisol. They actually enjoy better health and longevity. So status actually, even in other primates, high status drops cortisol. So what's happening for furlough, sometimes for some people, they perceive this as a loss of status. Now, if you perceive it as a loss of status, it then becomes a threat. I'm not saying everybody sees it that way because some people don't. I think also we've touched on uncertainty, but furloughing can create uncertainty. Will I be unfurloughed? Will I go back to my job? What's going to happen? And I think this creates greater uncertainty, greater threat, which can then feed into worry. And then the worry makes us more anxious, and the anxiety makes us worry more. And we can get caught in that circuit, which is called cognitive emotional fusion. And then we can maintain a level of threat by ruminating and worrying. The other factor is, the other button it presses for human beings is loss of autonomy. This is loss of control. It's been done to me. It can activate a sort of powerlessness, a helplessness. It doesn't make any difference. I can't do anything about this. And what we know is that that can activate worry and rumination as well. And then I think equity, fairness. We can feel this is unfair. Why has this happened to me? Why hasn't this happened to somebody else? Now, I'm not suggesting this is true for everybody, because for some people who've got children at home or they're furloughed towards the end of their career, they may say, this is great. I've got gardening leave. I can spend some more time schooling the children at home. This is going to help my partner. It's going to help me enjoy this period of time. So it comes back to not what happens, it's the view you take of it. But understanding that these buttons can be pressed is really important. And I think just bringing it back to the psychological contract is that if people feel there are broken promises, people have let them down, that can create a sense of anger, a sense of frustration. And then we can start to ruminate about that. This is unfair. Why have they done this? And interestingly, that has a neuroplastic effect, because whatever we use our mind for, it wires up neural circuits. And then we can start to worry or be angry and feel that we've been treated badly. And if we do that and ruminate about it, that can make us unwell.
So Brian, that's really interesting. And I think we've already touched upon the fact that there's so much individual variation in terms of how this will impact us and how this will impact our teams. But I think what we also know is that there are some core human psychological elements that help us ride out the storm and help us buffer this. So you've already touched upon inclusion, I think, being valued. Everyone wants to know that they're valued by the team, the group, the organization that they work for. So I think there are things that we can do that will help support colleagues who've been furloughed. And there are things that we can do for ourselves if we've been furloughed that will help to support us. And one of those things, Brian, is to kind of still feel connected to the people that you work with. The research is suggesting that leaders of teams that have people who have been furloughed often find it difficult. They often find themselves experiencing negative emotions such as guilt, distress, high levels of empathy for the person who's been furloughed. And so my question to you now is, how can we ensure that we still have the necessary conversations that we need to have to support furloughed colleagues, and not let our own kind of negative emotions get in the way of that?
I think, interestingly, even when we haven't got all this uncertainty and threat in our lives, this is fundamentally important. I mean, we've just done a big psychological audit for an international firm, and we've accrued about 100,000 data points on health and well-being, engagement surveys, appraisals, exit interviews, semi-structured interviews. The interesting thing is, when you correlate that data, you start to see factors that fall out of that data. And there were three big factors that accounted for most of the variance in psychological well-being. And those three factors was whether the leader or manager actually took an interest and cared about the employee. So they had conversations with them and they demonstrated an interest in the employee. The second factor was whether they were supportive of their professional development and their career. And the third factor was that they could have honest, open, transparent conversations. Now, if those three factors were met, those individuals in that part of the organization experienced better psychological well-being. They worked harder. They delivered more billable hours, their productivity was higher, but they perceived their workload as less stressful, and there was much less attrition. Now, what's happening here is that the organization, in a way, is fulfilling a psychological contract that creates social support and nourishment to those people, who then create a sense of reciprocity where they work harder for the organization. And I think this is really interesting because if you put that into the furloughing, I think what we need to do is increase our level of communication. The danger is that we're uncomfortable communicating with people who may be furloughed, so we avoid those difficult conversations. But what's been shown when people are in difficult situations, and this is true in the military, and this is true across many, many different domains, is that if you have social support and connection, I mean, there's an interesting study in the military where if the officers connected with their team, their unit regularly, and just had chats with them to debrief and to talk about stuff, that predicted the mental health of those soldiers 20 years later. This has a huge impact. We know that social support, social connection is the best protection against post-traumatic stress disorder. Good social support buffers stress and distress. So I think, to answer your question, I think one of the ways that organizations can build trust is through communication, is through honest, open, transparent conversations. People who break promises, you break trust. I think you have to be honest, and you have to be clear, and you have to be supportive. And I think if you do that, I think it gives people a sense of connection that I think is highly protective. So I think there's an irony here. And it's a bit like, you know, if I'm walking down the high street and I see someone who's recently bereaved, I think, oh my God, what am I going to say? And I duck into the shop. Now, what I really want to do is go and talk to them, but I don't know what I'm going to say, so I duck into the shop. The problem with that is it actually makes the problem worse, because they probably saw me duck into the shop. We can do the same thing with people who are furloughed, is that we don't communicate with them. We don't talk to them, because it's a difficult conversation, but it's an essential conversation. And if we can actually have those conversations, then, as you suggest, in the aftermath of this, I think in the recovery phase from this, those people are going to feel a sense of connection and engagement, and they're much more likely to come back and reconnect with the organization in a very positive way.
And I think the overall message is that there are a number of things that we know that nourish the human psychological spirit, and there are a number of things that deplete it. So Brian's touched on inclusion, cohesion, being part of things as things which nourish the psychological well-being. So what we want to think about next are, what are those key things? What can we do at the individual level? But importantly, what can our teams and our organizations do to help safeguard inclusion, performance, and culture over time? And Brian, we often use this lovely quote from Maya Angelou, which says that people will forget what you said and they will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So tuning into the things that we can do, particularly during this difficult period, to make people feel heard, to make people feel part of things, and to make people feel valued is incredibly important and protective, not just for the individuals, but for the group and group performance in the long term. So Brian, shall we have a look at some of the practical things that people can do now? And we'll both discuss these as we go. I think firstly, if you are a leader of a team, there's a number of things that you can do to help support colleagues who have been furloughed. And the first thing really is to start with awareness. So check in with yourself first and foremost to see how this is impacting you. So how are you feeling about it? How are you feeling about having those conversations? How are you thinking about it? And how can you most clearly behave and message in a way to your team that is authentic and helpful at this time? But also importantly, checking in with others. So checking in with all members of your team, both furloughed and non-furloughed, to see how they're doing. And as we talked about earlier, this can shift over time. So regular check-ins is really important. A second thing to do is to think about how you motivate, inspire, and engage your team. We're all idiosyncratic in the things that motivate us, but largely they're linked to things that intrinsically motivate us. So things that we feel proud of, we want to be part of, we're learning, things that intrinsically motivate us. And then the factors that are external to us. So these are rewards or avoidance of punishment. Now, interestingly, what's been shown is that in the context of furlough, if team leaders can help build that sense of intrinsic motivation, that sense of being part of this, that can go a long way to building the next point, which is trust. And Brian's touched upon the importance of trust for performance of teams and groups over time, and also for individual well-being. And one really nice way of maintaining motivation is to seek input from people. Hear what they have to say, hear their ideas, keep them included in the discussion and the narrative over time, so that people don't feel that they've been cut off and they're out on their own and they're excluded from the group. Hear what they have to say and hear their ideas for the future. The third one is to do with trust. And as Brian's talked about, the idea of authenticity, it's incredibly powerful in terms of our psychology. My ability to feel connected to you, your ability to feel connected to me, is very much down to how much you trust what I'm saying and how authentic you think I'm being in what I say and what I do. And the last one is about how do we sustain this morale over time? So that's taking the motivation part and moving it into a maintenance. How do I maintain a group identity, our team identity, when we're all working from different locations, when some members of staff have been furloughed and others maybe haven't, when perhaps our whole team has been furloughed? What are the things that we do to retain the essence of who we are and to keep that connected and collaborative and cohesive over time? Brian, anything you would add to that leadership piece?
I think only to say that one of the things that's been shown is that if leaders have a better tolerance of uncertainty, that actually, and it's true for all of us, I mean, you can build tolerance of uncertainty. It's a cognitive tool that you can actually strengthen tolerance of uncertainty. But leaders who have a high tolerance of uncertainty, high tolerance of ambiguity, then when they're faced with these situations, they often think, yeah, it's difficult. It's really difficult. The world's changed. We're in a different space. But we've got great people. We've got great skills. We need to pivot. We need to change. We can adapt. We need to think about how we make this work for us. What can we do? I think people who have leaders who have a low tolerance of uncertainty, that actually impacts on organizational success. So I think how leaders process this time will predict how they message, because if they become very anxious and distressed and they say, oh my God, this is awful, we're all going to hell in a handcart, it's a disaster, then that can start to impact on morale, energy, engagement, and it's got massive social Wi-Fi, it's contagious, and it cascades through the organization very quickly. So I think leadership have a role in building tolerance of uncertainty. And I think creating hope, a vision of hope, but linked to agency and pathway. So it's not just blind hope, it's hope attached to, okay, how are we going to get there? How are we going to deal with this? And if you can combine agency, pathway with a goal, that can start to motivate your people again.
And I think often in our work, Brian, at Positive, we talk about organizational cultures and cultural display roles. And typically what you would find is that it takes a long time and a lot of effort to change the culture and the behaviors in an organization. I think what's interesting at the minute is because there has been so much change, we've been shaken out of our day-to-day norms, routines, and habits. So actually, this is a really nice time to think about what we want our organizational culture to look like, what we want our behavioral norms and our social display rules to be like, and to take a really informed approach to this. So in the context of furlough and how our organization handles this, this is incredibly important. There are organizations who get this right will be in a much better place to come through this, to maintain the essence of who they are, the importance of their people, their supply chain, their product, their services. Everything links to the people in the organization and how they've been made to feel at this time. So if we can put our people first, show them, communicate and message through our behaviors, our actions, our frequency of communication, that we value them, that we're interested in how they're feeling, the experiences that they're having at this time, that's incredibly important. The second point I've got here is to motivate and inspire our people. So yes, these are difficult times. Yes, we are pivoting. We are trying to be innovative in our solutions. We're trying to look towards the future. And I think organizations that can share their vision of what that future is and the steps that they're taking to get there will again be in a good place to help their employees feel informed, secure. People can accept the level of uncertainty if they know what's being done to shore up and firm up certainty where possible. The third thing that we've really focused on today is the ability to take a psychologically informed approach to this. So rather than head down and get through, take a pause and reflect on the psychology of this. What is this doing to how we think, feel, and behave at the individual, the team, and the organizational level? And what are the factors that we know would really help support those three levels? And the final thing is then how do we start to cultivate behaviors and think about the legacy? When we come through this and out the other side of this, what legacy will be left for our employees and our people? How will we look back on this period? And how do we want to be remembered in terms of our behaviors and actions at this time? Brian, anything you would add to that?
No, I think that's fantastic. And I think I mean, just as you were speaking, I was just thinking of Mandela coming out of Robben Island and how he decided to talk about peace and reconciliation. This was something that South Africa hadn't experienced. And he managed to get people to buy into that concept instead of retribution and bloodshed. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a fantastic opportunity with disruption often to come back to what are the basic factors that nourish and deplete the human spirit. And I think tapping into those and reconnecting with those, I think we can really shift the dial. And I think that what organizations are now realizing, your first point here is putting people first. This is going to be what future-proofs people, because we're heading into, irrespective of coronavirus, with artificial intelligence, it's going to be, computers can't do people stuff. They can do technical stuff. They're not good at emotions and communication and connection. We are going to really see the value of people over the next, and people who are people and good communicators are going to be the best leaders. And I think we're going to have lots of other disruption and change from other areas. But I think if we can tolerate uncertainty and nourish these things that nourish the human spirit, we're much more likely to build a really high level of resilience.
And just as we draw to a close, I want to thank those of you that submitted questions for this session. We've tried to weave into our content as many answers as possible. If you've enjoyed the session today and you've enjoyed our approach to psychologically informed leadership, we are running a Manage Your Mind virtual leadership program. So this is a series of 4 webinars, and really they underpin Positive's 4 pillars of psychologically informed leadership. So they integrate the psychological theory with practical skills and techniques. And the 4 webinars that we're running are awareness, so exploring emotional literacy in leadership as the antidote to uncertainty. Secondly, focus, so how we start to manage worries, intrusive thoughts, how we start to manage those and build certainty and a sense of proaction in this time. The third is connection. So we've touched on that massively today, the importance of how we make each other feel and social support. And the last one is all around mindset. So how we wire up and cultivate a positive, protective mindset to help us weather this storm and the future ones that come our way. So if you're interested in this series, you can contact my colleague Toby Clyde-Smith at positivegroup.org, and we will send out some details in the post-coms to this. And the final thing that we want to share, Brian, I'm not sure if you want to talk through this, is our work with the NHS.
Yes, just very briefly, I actually wrote my thesis many years ago on burnout in doctors, and I think doctors and nurses and our frontline healthcare workers are facing an extraordinary period of pressure and distress, both for themselves, but also for their families, but also, I think, for the patients. And I was listening to an ITU consultant talking about this recently, about how you know, they are just not used to losing this number of patients through an ITU. They have a very good success rate of pulling people through. So I think this is an extraordinarily difficult time. I've actually just been in hospital myself recently and could not believe the quality of the care that I received. It was outstanding. So we're taking a program into the NHS free. We're delivering it as a technique for managing your mind through uncertainty. And we're also offering it actually to non-fee paying schools. So I think this is a great thing, and it's been very well received as so far. Have you any thoughts on that, Sinead?
No, just if you know anyone who works in an NHS trust who might value and appreciate this program, then please get in touch. And we would just like to finish by thanking you very much for your time and your interest today. We hope this has been insightful. We hope it's provided a bit of the psychology around the impact which furloughing might have on our individual staff members, but also how it might impact performance and culture over time, and the things that we can do to help buffer this. So Brian, that's all from me. Anything else from you?
Nope, that's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.